You were probably taught that shifting reality takes time. Months of visualization, years of healing, endless effort, repetition, discipline. That breakthroughs must be earned through struggle, and that alignment only comes after you've perfected yourself, fixed every wound, mastered every spiritual method available. But what if the real shift doesn't happen through accumulation at all? What if it happens in a moment so quiet, so understated, that most people overlook it entirely? There is a subtle pattern that appears right before a life truly changes. Not when someone pushes harder, not when they try again, but when something inside them releases. When the forcing stops, when the chasing dissolves, when doubt loosens its grip. That is the moment the field responds, not to effort, but to state. In this transmission, you're going to feel into the frequency that precedes a genuine quantum shift. You'll understand why simplicity is the one thing the ego resists most. You'll begin to recognize the energetic capacities that matter more than any external strategy. And you'll see why what looks like a breakdown is often not failure at all, but initiation. Let's begin with something you've likely felt but never fully named: the resistance to ease. That moment when things begin to flow and a quiet fear appears. When clarity arrives, but the mind demands evidence. When your inner knowing is strong, yet your conditioning asks for proof. That tension you feel is not confusion. It's the friction between soul-level coherence and a survival-based identity. We live in a culture that glorifies struggle. Effort is praised, complexity is worshipped. If something feels too simple, it must be wrong. If it comes easily, it must be undeserved. But the quantum field doesn't respond to how hard you work. It responds to how clean your signal is, to how coherent your inner state has become. And coherence is almost always simple. That simplicity, however, threatens the false self. Because if it's simple, then what was all the struggle for? If it's simple, what happens to the identity built around striving, fixing, proving, enduring? Simplicity removes the drama. And without drama, there is nowhere left to hide. This is why so many people unconsciously sabotage their own shifts. Not because they are broken, but because they are uncomfortable with how quiet the truth actually is. They expect intensity. They receive stillness. They look for signs and fireworks. The field answers with silence. And inside that silence is where the shift lives. The quantum field is always mirroring. It isn't waiting for your next affirmation. It isn't responding to your effort. It's resonating with your current identity. And the moment you stop trying to force change and simply become, the feedback loop alters. You stop asking the external to validate the internal. You stop tuning your frequency to circumstances. Instead, you hold your tone regardless of what appears. This is the distinction between manifesting and shifting. Manifesting often carries an undertone of lack. Shifting is identity-based. It is becoming the version of you that already exists in another now. And the distance between you and that timeline is not time, not effort, but resonance. So consider this gently. What if the shift isn't hard, only unfamiliar? What if you've been trying to think your way into a new reality, instead of feeling your way into it? And what if the true block has never been your environment, but your attachment to complexity? We'll continue from here. If quantum shifting is truly simple, why do so few people experience it? Why does it feel like an invisible wall keeps you looping through the same emotional patterns, even when you know better? Why do your efforts plateau right when you believe you're close? The answer isn't lack of effort. It's that simplicity demands something far more confronting than effort ever will. It demands awareness. Awareness without the safety net of complexity can feel destabilizing. When things are complicated, there's always something to blame. The method, the timing, the process. But when it's simple, there's nowhere to hide. The attention turns inward, and you're left facing one essential question. Am I actually ready to shift? This is where most people lose coherence. Not because they're incapable, but because they encounter their blind spots. Blind spots are not flaws. They're patterns you've normalized, emotional reflexes that feel like personality. stories you've repeated so long they now feel factual. But the quantum field doesn't respond to what you consciously want, it responds to what you unconsciously are. So while your mind visualizes abundance, your frequency may still be coded in scarcity. Not because you're failing, but because you've never questioned the signal you default to. Take a moment to feel into this. What are you broadcasting when no one is watching? What is the emotional climate of your inner world when you're not doing the work? That is your real frequency. That is what the field reads. This is where the first true mastery emerges. Self-awareness. Not surface-level reflection, but the capacity to observe your inner movements as they happen, to notice thoughts without collapsing into them, to recognize survival reactions without obeying them. Awareness isn't passive, it's stabilizing. Then comes a deeper threshold, radical responsibility. This is not self-blame, it's ownership. It's the willingness to acknowledge everything you're emitting, especially the parts you'd rather disown. When you shift from asking, "Why is this happening to me?" to, "What is this showing me about my resonance?" the field responds differently. Victimhood is loud but incoherent. Ownership is quiet and magnetic. From here, another stabilizing skill comes online: holding your state. Most people wait for life to confirm their frequency. Quantum shifters do the opposite. They hold their tone until life has no choice but to mirror it. Holding a state doesn't mean forcing positivity. It means staying coherent even when evidence hasn't arrived yet. And then comes the most paradoxical capacity of all: detachment from perception. We're trained to label everything: good, bad, progress, failure. But what if the moment that feels like collapse is actually the final recalibration before the shift? What if what you're interpreting as breakdown is simply your old frequency losing coherence? Detachment doesn't mean emotional numbness. It means you stop assigning verdicts too quickly. You let experiences move through you without deciding what they mean, because the quantum field isn't linear. Sometimes the darkest moment is the precise calibration required for the next level of light to land. You're not learning to think differently. You're learning to hold your vibration as truth, even when appearances fluctuate. And that requires courage. It's easier to distract yourself with techniques. It's harder to sit in stillness and admit that the loop persists because old stories are still filtering perception. Quantum shifting isn't complex, but it is surgical. It cuts cleanly through illusion. It reveals the parts of you that still need chaos to feel alive and quietly asks if you're willing to let them rest. In the next movement, we'll enter the moment right before the shift. The strange tension that arises when an old identity begins to dissolve and a new timeline is close enough to feel but not yet anchored. This is where most people turn back. But if you recognize it, you'll realize it's the threshold. There is a moment that arrives just before a true quantum shift. It's subtle, disorienting, and often misunderstood. It's the space where the old timeline begins to loosen, but the new one hasn't fully anchored yet. You feel suspended, as if you're standing in a narrow corridor between realities. The past no longer fits. The future isn't clear, and everything inside you urges action. This space is sacred, but it rarely feels that way. It often shows up as confusion, exhaustion, emotional instability, or a sense of misalignment. You might feel like you're failing, like the path you trusted has disappeared, like your vision is unraveling instead of manifesting. And if you don't understand what's happening, you'll misinterpret this state as a signal to retreat, to push harder, or to doubt yourself. But this is not collapse, it's calibration. Before any quantum shift can stabilize, your field must release its current coherence pattern. It's like detuning from one radio station before locking into another. There is always static in between. That static feels like emotional noise, restlessness, and uncertainty. But it's not a warning, it's a threshold. The frequency that held your old identity together can no longer support what's emerging. The beliefs, habits, and energetic loops that once defined you are losing charge. And without that charge, the ego has nothing to anchor itself to. So it reacts. It generates fear. It amplifies doubt. It urges movement. This is not a failure of alignment. It's the ego attempting to pull you back into familiar coherence. This is where most people stop. Not because the field has rejected them, but because they interpret friction as proof that something is wrong. They mistake the resistance of transformation for evidence of defeat. But if things feel unstable, you're likely close. If clarity disappears temporarily, you're often right at the edge, because what you're experiencing is your frequency shedding what no longer matches the next timeline. This is why detachment becomes essential here. The moment you label this phase as wrong, stuck, or broken, you restabilize the old pattern. If instead you remain present without forcing meaning, something shifts beneath the surface. The chaos softens. The pressure dissolves. Forward movement happens without effort. This is when magnetism activates, not through trying, but through the cessation of resistance. Right before the shift, your nervous system is learning to hold more power. And that power doesn't come from intensity. It comes from coherence, from staying present inside uncertainty without collapsing your identity. When you can remain aware without judgment, your field begins to organize itself around stillness. That's when the quantum responds. So what is required of you in this space? Nothing in the traditional sense. This is not the moment to fix, force, or hustle. This is the moment to tune, to breathe into discomfort, to observe the stories that arise, to soften your grip on outcome. Your role is not to create a new reality. Your role is to become available for the one already aligned with your frequency. That is the real shift. Not control, but surrender into resonance. From here, we'll move into how the field reads your signal and why what you believe you're transmitting is often different from what's actually being received. We'll also explore how to clean resonance so your life can finally organize around the timeline that's already waiting. Let's talk about signals. You've probably heard that the quantum field responds to frequency, not words. But here's what most people miss. Your energy is always broadcasting, whether you're aware of it or not. And what you broadcast is not your intention, it's your embodiment. You can say you're ready. You can repeat affirmations, visualize your ideal life, meditate daily. But if beneath those practices, your signal is still laced with urgency, doubt, fear, or the need to prove something, that is the message the field receives. The field doesn't decode language. It mirrors resonance. This is why your inner world is not just important. It's the only strategy. Your nervous system is the instrument through which your reality is tuned, and coherence, the alignment between thought, emotion, and state, is the signature the quantum field recognizes. Coherence doesn't require perfection, it requires presence. Imagine tuning a radio. Even a slight misalignment creates static. You might catch fragments of sound, pieces of music, but the signal is distorted. The same is true for your frequency. When you want something but don't trust it, ask for something but don't feel safe receiving it, speak confidently while holding doubt internally, your signal becomes fragmented, and fragmentation produces one response from the field: delay. This is why quantum shifting isn't about doing more. It's about cleaning the signal, and cleaning doesn't mean suppressing emotion, it means aligning it. It means owning your internal state so fully that there is no split between what you intend and what you embody. Here's where most people get trapped. They try to force coherence. They attempt to think their way into a feeling. They analyze their vibration, monitor their emotions, manage their inner state like a project. But coherence doesn't come from control. It comes from surrender. You can't fake resonance. You can't intellectually construct magnetic alignment. You soften into it by allowing yourself to be honest about where you are. Resonance emerges when there is no internal resistance to your own truth. So what creates a signal the quantum field responds to? Clarity, stillness, emotional honesty, and the willingness to embody what you desire before it shows up externally. Not as performance, not as denial, but as calm certainty. This is the signal. I already am. I already hold. I already resonate. Not because circumstances confirm it, but because it's internally stable. When your nervous system begins to trust your frequency, it stabilizes. And when your signal stabilizes, your external reality can finally organize around it. Not through force, but through entrainment, through resonance. This is where your field starts to shift, not by striving, but by attunement. You stop trying to convince reality. You allow reality to catch up to your state. From here, we'll explore how attention acts as a selector in the quantum field, how focus collapses potential into experience, and why effort, more often than not, is the least effective way to generate real change. Now let's look at how the quantum field actually responds. Because if you've ever wondered why some intentions seem to manifest instantly while others linger indefinitely, the answer isn't luck or timing. It's attention. The field doesn't reward desire. It reflects your dominant vibration. And that vibration is shaped moment by moment by where your attention consistently lives. The quantum field is infinite. Every possible version of you already exists within it. Every outcome, every timeline, already encoded. In quantum mechanics, the observer effect shows us that particles don't collapse into form until they are observed, until attention selects them, which means your focus isn't passive, it's creative. It determines which version of reality becomes tangible. This is where most people misunderstand the process. They try to control outcomes instead of stabilizing attention. They think about abundance briefly, then slip into worry. They visualize a new life, then emotionally rehearse old fears. They fall asleep asking for change and wake up scanning for proof it hasn't arrived. That's not coherence. That's a fragmented broadcast. The field doesn't judge that fragmentation. It simply mirrors it, which is why results appear inconsistent, delayed, or unclear. But when attention becomes steady, something shifts. When you learn to hold your focus without chasing, grasping, or doubting, the potential timeline begins to organize itself around you. People, opportunities, resources, and subtle decisions align, not because you forced them, but because resonance drew them into coherence. You are not making reality change. You are collapsing into the version of reality that already matches your frequency. Here's the nuance few teachings address. You don't shift with thought alone. You shift with identity. Your conscious thoughts may want transformation, but your subconscious identity, the emotional baseline you live from, might still be tuned to the old pattern. And the field always mirrors identity over intention. This is why inner work matters, not as a checklist, not as constant fixing, but as remembrance. Each time you return to coherence, not by effort, but by recognition, you reinforce a new identity. One that isn't being built, but revealed. So ask yourself quietly, who are you being right now? Not what are you trying to become, but what tone are you holding? What truth are you embodying? What state feels familiar? Because the version of you living the timeline you desire is not waiting somewhere in the future. That version is already present, already available. And you access it not by reaching forward, but by receiving inward. In the next movement, we'll bring this journey into integration. You'll see how quantum shifting becomes not an event, but a way of living. And how to stabilize a new timeline so it doesn't appear briefly and fade, but becomes your new normal. Now let's integrate everything. Because quantum shifting is not meant to be a rare event or a dramatic breakthrough. It's meant to become a way of living. A natural state you return to, not something you chase. By now, you can see that the field doesn't respond to effort. It responds to coherence. It doesn't react to what you say you want. It mirrors what you consistently are. And the shift you've been seeking has never been external. It has always been internal, subtle, and far simpler than the ego prefers to believe. Simplicity is uncomfortable for the ego because it removes excuses. If the shift is simple, then there's nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to earn. There's only alignment. And alignment demands honesty, not perfection, but truth. Those who stabilize in new timelines understand this. They don't do more. They don't try harder. They align more cleanly, more calmly, more sincerely. They stop running after a future version of themselves and start embodying the one that already exists. This doesn't mean pretending. It doesn't mean suppressing grief or forcing positivity. Emotional mastery isn't emotional avoidance. It's the capacity to hold the full spectrum of experience without collapsing your identity into it. You can feel uncertainty without becoming uncertain. You can feel sadness without becoming small. You can feel fear without letting it define your frequency. That is energetic maturity, and that is what the quantum field responds to. When you live this way, reality begins to reflect you differently. You stop chasing confirmation. You stop reacting to every fluctuation. Your energy enters a space before your words do. You speak less, but you're felt more. You ask less, but receive more. Not because you're manipulating the field, but because you are no longer resisting it. Life stops feeling like a pursuit and starts behaving like a mirror. At this point, something subtle usually happens. The urgency fades. The pressure dissolves. You're no longer scanning for signs. You're no longer asking if it's working. You're simply present. And presence is the highest form of coherence. This is how a new timeline stabilizes, not through repetition, but through residence. You stay long enough in the state that it becomes familiar. And once it's familiar, it becomes normal. And once it's normal, reality has no choice but to conform. The shift doesn't require constant attention. It requires consistency of being, a quiet commitment to return to your signal whenever you notice yourself drifting into old patterns. Not with judgment, but with awareness. And this is where mastery becomes transmission. Those who truly shift don't teach methods, they transmit states, they don't add information, they reveal something ancient already alive within you, which brings us to the invitation. This is your invitation to remember what you already are, right here, in this moment. Not in some perfected future, not after everything is resolved, but now. The timeline already exists. The one where you are clear, calm, magnetic, and aligned. Not because life around you is flawless, but because you no longer outsource your frequency to circumstances. You stop asking the external world who you are. You stop negotiating your state based on outcomes. You hold your signal from within, steady, grounded, self-referenced. That is what stabilizes a shift. Let this be the signal you return to, again and again, not to perform, not to convince, but to belong, to yourself, to your own coherence. And if you've made it this far, you already know this was never just information. This is a transmission. Something subtle but unmistakable has already begun to reorganize inside you. A quiet recalibration, a remembering. If you felt it, if something clicked, if this resonated beyond words, then stay connected. Subscribe. Not just for the next video, but for the next version of you. Because this isn't just a channel, it's a frequency. Every subscriber is a signal to the field. A recognition that says, I remember who I am. Welcome back. You were never becoming the shift. You have always been the shift. And now, the field knows it too. This is why those who truly master manifestation rarely teach techniques. They don't focus on methods. They transmit states. They don't try to give you something new. They help you remember something ancient that's already alive inside you. Nothing is added. Something is revealed. And this is your invitation. Not to become something different, but to remember what you already are, right now, in this moment. The timeline exists. The one where you are calm, clear, magnetic, and aligned. Not because everything around you is perfect, but because you've stopped outsourcing your frequency to circumstances. You no longer wait for the external world to grant you permission to be coherent. You don't negotiate your inner state based on what happens next. You hold your signal from within, quiet, stable, self-referenced. That is what stabilizes a quantum shift. Let this be the shift that lasts. Let this be the signal you return to again and again. Not to perform, not to prove, but to belong, to yourself, to your own resonance. And if you've stayed with this transmission until now, you already know this wasn't just a video. Something subtle has already begun to rearrange inside you. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. A recalibration, a remembering. If you felt it, if something resonated beneath the words, if a quiet recognition occurred, then stay connected. Subscribe. Not just for another video, but for the next version of you. Because this isn't just a channel, it's a frequency. Every subscriber becomes a signal to the field. A silent declaration that says, I remember who I am. Welcome back. You were never becoming the shift. You have always been the shift. And now, the field recognizes it too.